Hey guys, tonight we are going to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into a journey back to a time when death wasn't just inconveniently permanent, it was physically everywhere. Imagine walking down a bustling London street in, say, 1840. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, maybe a hint of gin, and something else. Something heavy, sweet, and deeply unsettling clinging to the back of your throat. That, my friends, is the smell of the recently departed. Or more accurately, the smell of the overly recently departed, crammed shoulder to shoulder, quite literally in the ground beneath your very feet. You might think you're safe in your modern home tucked into bed, but honestly, after hearing about this, you might be glad you're not living in a ground floor flat in Victorian London. You probably wouldn't survive this comfortably without a serious air freshener budget. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always cool to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there in the heart of London, and the city feels alive, vibrant, buzzing with energy. But just beneath the surface, or sometimes right on the surface, is a problem literally piling up. For centuries, burying the dead had been a local affair. Each parish had its church, and each church had its graveyard. Simple, traditional, and for a long time perfectly functional. But then something happened. London exploded. The population surged, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, by people flocking from the countryside, seeking work, seeking a new life. And all those people eventually needed somewhere to go when their time came. The small, ancient churchyards, often just tiny pockets of green, squeezed between buildings, simply couldn't cope. They were never designed for the sheer volume of death that a rapidly growing metropolis generates. Think about it, the same small patch of ground used for generations. You bury someone, the earth settles, maybe years later, you need to dig another grave in the same spot. Historically, this meant disturbing older remains. It wasn't considered disrespectful in the same way we might think of it today. It was a practical necessity. Bones were often gathered and stored in charnel houses, those slightly spooky buildings, sometimes attached to churches specifically designed for housing old bones, like a historical boneyard storage unit. Convenient, if a little macabre. But even the charnel houses were filling up, fast. The ground in these parish graveyards became saturated with bodies. Imagine digging a grave only to hit another coffin, just a few feet down, sometimes even less. The soil wasn't really soil anymore. It was a thick, dark, greasy mixture of decomposed organic matter, coffin wood, and, well, you get the picture. It was essentially human compost on an industrial scale. But instead of being neatly bagged for gardening, it was just there. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The constant digging, the turning over of saturated earth released noxious gases and foul odors into the air. Victorians, remember, were obsessed with miasmas, the idea that bad smells themselves cause disease. And while the direct link between smell and germ theory, which hadn't been fully accepted yet, wasn't quite right, they weren't entirely wrong about the connection between these conditions and sickness. The same lack of sanitation that polluted their rivers and slums was now polluting their burial grounds, which were often right in the middle of densely populated residential areas. You could live in a house with a graveyard practically in your backyard. Your children might play amongst the tombstones. The well providing your drinking water might be just yards from ground used for centuries as a burial pit. It's easy to see how disease could spread like wildfire in such an environment. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, the killers of the age, thrived in unsanitary conditions. And these graveyards were the epitome of unsanitary conditions. Mainstream historical fact time. By the mid-19th century, central London churchyards were estimated to contain tens of thousands of bodies, crammed into spaces originally intended for perhaps a few hundred. Some sources claim burials were stacked 10, 20, or even 30 deep in prime spots. Yes, stacked. Like really morbid firewood. Now for a quirky tidbit, because space was so limited and expensive, churchyards would sometimes level the ground by adding a layer of fresh soil on top of the existing overflowing graves. This would temporarily raise the ground level, giving the illusion of more space and delaying the inevitable. but also meant that the whole area was just getting higher and higher on a foundation of compressed corpses. Imagine your local park slowly gaining altitude every year due to decomposition. Delightful. This crisis wasn't a sudden event. It built gradually over decades. Clergy who profited from burial fees often resisted calls for reform, wanting to keep the lucrative business within their parish control. The poor had few options other than the parish churchyard, regardless of its state. The wealthy could afford burial vaults or plots further afield, but the vast majority of Londoners relied on these increasingly horrific local spots. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for cemetery reform was purely public health concern, or if it was equally or perhaps even more motivated by the emerging entrepreneurial spirit seeing a massive commercial opportunity. Was it genuinely about stopping the spread of disease, or was it about property developers and transport companies spotting a gap in the market the size of, well, the entire population of London eventually? Probably a bit of both, like most things in history. Nobody ever does anything just for one simple reason, do they? Especially not when there's money to be made. The smell was just the most obvious pungent symptom of a much deeper problem. A city literally running out of space to put its dead. And the solutions, as we'll see, got pretty strange. The stage was set for drastic change, spurred on by the sheer, undeniable, overwhelming stink and visible horror emanating from the very places meant to offer rest. You're still there walking through the London air, that particular scent heavy around you. But it wasn't just the smell that became unbearable. It was the sheer, undeniable visibility of the problem. You couldn't ignore it. Gravestones tilted precariously, sometimes sinking into the saturated earth. Coffins, if buried too shallowly or disturbed by subsequent digging, could break open, their contents spilling out. Imagine seeing fragments of bone or decaying wood poking out of the soil in a place you walk past every day. It wasn't a hidden horror. It was increasingly part of the urban landscape. People talked about it, whispered about it, but for a long time it felt like an insurmountable problem. Part of the gritty reality of city life you just had to tolerate. Like noisy upstairs neighbors who are also possibly ghosts. You just learned to live with the banging. But not everyone was willing to just tolerate it. As the situation worsened, voices began to rise. Individuals, often driven by a mix of genuine philanthropic concern and a burgeoning understanding of public health, started to campaign for change. They were the early reformers, the ones who looked at the overflowing graveyards not just as an unfortunate fact of life, but as a scandal that needed to be addressed. They weren't necessarily politicians or people in positions of power at first. They were often doctors, clergymen appalled by the conditions in their own parishes, or social commentators. People who saw the rot quite literally and felt compelled to act. One of the most prominent of these early voices was Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith. Now, Southwood Smith was already a significant figure in public health reform. He had worked with Edwin Chadwick on groundbreaking reports about the terrible living conditions in sanitation or lack thereof in the slums. He understood the link between environment and disease better than most at the time, even before germ theory was fully formed. He saw the graveyards not just as unsightly or smelly, but as active sources of illness, pumping out their noxious effluvia into the surrounding air and potentially polluting water sources. He wrote passionately and graphically about what he observed. Imagine sitting down in your gaslit study, the flickering flame casting shadows, and reading a report by Southwood Smith from the 1840s. He didn't pull any punches. He described digging operations where the gravediggers had to wear masks because of the unbearable stench and dangerous gases. He recounted stories of bodies being unearthed accidentally, of coffins being stacked so high that the top ones were barely covered by earth. He detailed the health problems faced by people living adjacent to these burial grounds, linking their chronic illnesses and high death rates to the conditions next door. He was essentially shouting from the rooftops, armed with horrifying anecdotes and what little epidemiological data he could gather. It was like reading a horror story, but one where the monsters were real and buried just down the street. These reformers used the tools available to them. They wrote pamphlets, published articles in newspapers, gave lectures to anyone who would listen. They appealed to people's sense of decency, their fear of disease, and their growing awareness of social responsibility. They commissioned surveys and gathered evidence, trying to quantify the scale of the problem in dry official terms while simultaneously painting vivid pictures of the gruesome reality to stir public emotion. It was a combination of scientific for the time analysis and pure unadulterated shock tactics. Look, yet they seem to say, this is happening right here, right now, and it's killing you. The public reaction was mixed. For those living near the worst graveyards, it was validation of their daily misery and fear. They knew it was bad. Having someone official document it and say it was wrong was powerful. For others further away, it might have seemed like exaggeration or just another unpleasant aspect of city life to be ignored. There was also a deep-seated conservatism about burial practices. Changing centuries-old traditions, especially those linked so closely to religious rites and community identity, is never easy. People felt a connection to their local churchyard. Their ancestors were buried there. The idea of being buried somewhere else, perhaps far away, felt alien and unsettling. And then there was the resistance from those with vested interests. As we touched on before, the clergy of the overcrowded city parishes made significant income from burial fees. Every burial meant money for the church, and the sexton the person who often doubled as the gravedigger. Calls to close or regulate these graveyards were met with fierce opposition from those who saw their livelihood threatened. They argued that the conditions weren't that bad, that reformers were exaggerating, or that alternative arrangements would be too expensive or impractical. Imagine trying to convince someone their profitable side hustle of stacking decomposing bodies had to stop. Not an easy conversation. The government at first was slow to act. There was no single body responsible for public health in the way we understand it today. Responsibility for burials fell under ecclesiastical law and local parish control. Changing things required parliamentary action, which meant navigating bureaucracy, political infighting, and lobbying from various interest groups. It wasn't a simple case of someone saying, "Hey, this is gross and dangerous," and everyone immediately agreeing to fix it. It took years of campaigning, of relentless pressure from reformers, and unfortunately, probably more than a few cholera outbreaks and public health panics, to really push the issue onto the legislative agenda. Mainstream historical fact time. The first major official acknowledgement of the problem came with reports commissioned by the government, spurred by reformers like Southwood Smith. One of the most influential was the 1843 Report on the Practice of Interment in Towns, which documented the horrific conditions in shocking detail and provided undeniable evidence that the existing system was unsustainable and dangerous. This report wasn't light reading. It was designed to appall and galvanize action. Now, for a quirky tidbit, despite the general horror, some people developed surprisingly morbid coping mechanisms. One account from the time describes children in overcrowded churchyards playing games that involved using old coffin wood found lying around, or even disturbingly making toys out of bones. When death was so ever-present and visible, perhaps it lost some of its abstract terror and just became another slightly disturbing part of the urban environment you interacted with. Like finding a rogue snail in your salad, but significantly more concerning. Reformers also faced the challenge of public perception. For some, the idea of disturbing graves was deeply sacrilegious, regardless of how overcrowded or unsanitary they were. The concept of rest in peace was taken very literally, and any suggestion of moving remains or closing traditional burial grounds was met with religious and emotional opposition. It wasn't just about science or sanitation. It was about faith tradition and the emotional ties to the deceased. Historians still argue whether the eventual legislative changes were primarily a triumph of public health advocacy and rational reform, or if they were simply an inevitable consequence of unchecked urban growth, forcing a logistical crisis that could no longer be ignored by any means necessary. Was it the persuasive power of Southwood Smith's pen, or the simple, undeniable reality that there was literally nowhere left to dig that finally tipped the scales? Like many historical shifts, it was likely a complex interplay of moral outrage, scientific understanding, economic opportunity, and sheer unavoidable necessity. You can only cram so many people into one place, living or dead, before something has to give. And in this case, the ground itself was giving way. The scene was set. The problem was widely known. The reformers were making noise, and the system was clearly broken. The question wasn't if something had to change, but how, when, and who would profit or lose from the transformation. The wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly, especially when trying to move something as heavy and entrenched as the entire population of dead Londoners. But the pressure was building layer upon layer, just like the burials themselves. You're wading deeper into the mess now, literally and figuratively. The smells, the sights, the constant reminders of death, lurking just below the surface or worse, actively pushed up to greet you. It all contributed to an atmosphere heavy with dread and the very real threat of illness. In the mid-19th century, the understanding of disease was still evolving. Germ theory, the idea that tiny microorganisms cause sickness, wasn't widely accepted yet. The dominant theory, the one that made intuitive sense when faced with overflowing cesspools and rotting corpses, was the miasma theory. This theory proposed that diseases like cholera, typhus, and fever were caused by miasma, or bad air, noxious vapors rising from decaying organic matter. Think about standing near one of those overloaded London cemeteries. The stench alone was enough to make you feel sick. It reeked of decomposition, foul gases, and general unpleasantness. Under the miasma theory, this wasn't just an offensive odor. It was the literal carrier of disease. The air itself, thick and heavy with these vapors, was thought to infiltrate your body and cause you to fall ill. It sounds quaint now, doesn't it? The idea that sniffing something nasty could give you cholera, like catching the flu from a really bad smell. But in a world without microscopes and petri dishes, it was a perfectly logical explanation for why people got sick near areas of intense decay and filth. And the graveyards, of course, were perfect miasma factories, packed full of decomposing bodies disturbed regularly by new burials often waterlogged or built on former marshland. They were constantly releasing those bad airs. People living downwind or nearby were considered to be at the highest risk. You'd hear stories perhaps whispered over tea or read in a campaigning pamphlet about families where everyone suddenly fell sick and someone would point to the churchyard wall just outside their window. Correlation in this case felt like undeniable causation. The periodic outbreaks of terrifying diseases like cholera only amplified these fears and the perceived link to the graveyards. Cholera in particular was a devastating visitor to London. It struck, suddenly killed quickly, and seemed to spread inexplicably, causing widespread panic. While we now know cholera is a waterborne bacterial disease, thanks John Snow, legend at the time, the outbreak seemed to sweep in on waves of bad air. And where was the bad air strongest? Near the places teeming with decomposition. The overcrowded cemeteries became prime suspects, seen not just as passive resting places, but as active vectors of contagion-breathing illness into the heart of the city. Reformers like Southwood Smith hammered this point home relentlessly. They used the language of public health even if their scientific understanding was based on miasma. They argued that closing or moving the cemeteries wasn't just about tidiness or respect for the dead. It was an urgent matter of protecting the living. They gathered data showing higher rates of fever and other illnesses in parishes with the most overcrowded burial grounds. They documented cases of cemetery workers suffering chronic illnesses. They painted a grim picture of death feeding death, with the graveyards acting as staging grounds for the next epidemic. Think about the psychological impact on the public. You're already living in a city that's noisy, dirty, and often smelly. Disease is a constant, ever-present threat. Death rates are high, particularly among children. Then you're told convincingly that the very places where you bury your loved ones are making everyone else sick. It must have felt like a cruel, inescapable trap. You wanted to bury your family with dignity, but doing so felt increasingly like a betrayal of the health of your remaining family and neighbors. It adds a layer of tragic irony to the situation. Mainstream historical fact. The Great Stink of 1858, while primarily caused by the raw sewage in the River Thames, was a pivotal moment. The overwhelming stench across the city, reaching even the Houses of Parliament, was widely interpreted through the miasma lens. The fear of disease carried by this bad air was so potent that it finally spurred the government into taking large-scale action on sanitation, including indirectly reinforcing the need to move burials away from dense urban areas and sources of potential miasma. It proved that powerful smells, whether from sewage or decomposition, could actually trigger political will. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some Victorian doctors firmly believing in miasma would carry strong-smelling substances like camphor or vinegar-soaked rags to ward off the bad air when visiting sick patients or unsanitary areas like the graveyards. You'd see them walking around holding a hanky to their nose, probably looking very dramatic, convinced they were building an invisible shield against disease with the power of potent aromas. It's the historical equivalent of holding your breath when you walk past a particularly pungent bin, but with higher stakes and more theatrical flair. This period marked a crucial shift. While the science wasn't perfect, the connection between environment and health was becoming undeniable. The repeated health crises provided a grim, undeniable rationale for implementing large-scale public works and regulatory changes that might have seemed impossible or too expensive before. The public health argument provided a powerful, non-religious, and increasingly evidence-based reason to override tradition and vested interests. It wasn't just about tidying up, it was about survival. Historians still argue whether the public health crisis was the primary driver for the eventual cemetery reforms, or if it merely provided the necessary urgency and justification for changes that were already being pushed by logistical necessity and changing urban aesthetics. Did the fear of cholera truly outweigh the sanctity of the old churchyards? Or did the sheer impossibility of finding space simply make the health arguments politically viable? It's a classic chicken and egg scenario in historical causation, where multiple factors are pushing in the same direction, making it hard to isolate the single most important one. But regardless of the primary driver, the argument that overcrowded graveyards were a direct threat to the health of the living became a central pillar of the case for reform. The stage was now fully set. The problem was visible and undeniable. Reformers had identified it and were shouting about it. The economic interests were resisting, and perhaps most powerfully, the recurring specter of disease interpreted through the prevailing understanding of miasma provided a potent and terrifying reason for the public and politicians alike to finally pay attention and consider radical solutions. You could no longer just politely ignore the smell of death and decay wafting over your backyard fence when you believed it was actively trying to kill you. So the air is thick with dread and bad smells, the ground is literally groaning under the weight of too many dead, and you're starting to suspect that the quaint little churchyard down the lane might actually be actively trying to poison your entire street. This wasn't just a vague feeling of unease. It was becoming a widespread concern amplified by a dedicated group of people who decided enough was enough. The push for reform wasn't some sudden spontaneous uprising. It was the result of years of campaigning, data collection, even if the interpretation was sometimes wonky and persistent lobbying. Think of these reformers as the Victorian era's version of public health influencers, but instead of shilling kale smoothies, they were promoting not burying people on top of each other. Led by figures like the aforementioned Dr. Southwood Smith, a physician with a strong social conscience, and later incorporating the efforts of social reformers like Edwin Chadwick, famous for his work on the poor laws and sanitation, but who saw overcrowded burial grounds as another piece of the urban health puzzle. These were people who weren't just complaining, they were documenting the problem and proposing solutions. They didn't have Instagram or Twitter, so their tools were reports, pamphlets, newspaper articles, and public lectures. Smith's reports, often graphic in their descriptions, detailed the appalling state of the burial grounds. He didn't shy away from talking about disturbed graves, overflowing soil, and the noxious odors emanating from the churchyards. Chadwick, with his focus on empirical data, helped frame the issue in economic terms, arguing that poor health caused by unsanitary conditions, including burial grounds, cost the state money in terms of lost productivity and increased healthcare costs. Yes, even in the Victorian era, the argument sometimes boiled down to, it's cheaper to fix this now than pay for everyone getting sick later. A timeless classic of political persuasion, really. These reformers were up against powerful vested interests. Remember the parish priests and clerks we talked about earlier? They made a tidy income from burial fees. Undertakers also benefited from the existing system. Landowners who had cemeteries on their property weren't exactly eager to give them up without a fight. And of course, there was the sheer force of tradition and religious sentiment. For centuries, people had been buried in their local churchyard close to the church itself, close to their ancestors. It was a deep-seated practice, and moving burials elsewhere felt to many like a betrayal of the dead and a disruption of the natural order. So the reformers had to be persuasive, persistent, and often quite brave in the face of opposition and sometimes even public ridicule. They highlighted not just the health risks, but also the sheer lack of dignity. Imagine visiting a loved one's grave only to find that a new burial nearby had disturbed the earth, perhaps even exposing older remains. Or seeing children playing on ground that you knew was only inches deep above decomposing bodies. It was profoundly unsettling, and the reformers used these vivid examples to appeal to people's sense of decency and respect. Mainstream historical fact time. One of the most significant steps in building official awareness was the commissioning of various reports by government bodies. The 1843 Royal Commission on the State of Large Towns and Populous Districts, for example, included a detailed section on burial grounds drawing heavily on the evidence compiled by reformers like Southwood Smith. These official reports, published and debated in Parliament, lent significant weight to the reformers' arguments, moving the issue from the realm of concerned citizens and into the political spotlight. It's one thing for a doctor to write a pamphlet. It's another entirely when a government commission backs up his claims with official findings. The reformers also pushed for legislative change. Bills were introduced in Parliament aimed at regulating burials or enabling the creation of new large cemeteries away from urban centers. However, these early attempts often failed. The opposition was strong, the costs seemed prohibitive, and there wasn't always enough political will to overcome the inertia and the powerful lobbying from those who benefited from the status quo. It's a classic tale of trying to implement change against deeply entrenched systems and financial interests. You'd think dealing with overflowing graves would be a no-brainer, but politics right. Here's a quirky tidbit related to the campaigning. Some reformers used rather dramatic visual aids. There are accounts of activists presenting parliamentarians or public meetings with gruesome findings from the burial grounds. Perhaps a sample of foul-smelling soil or even unsettling reports of bones being dug up and sold. Yes, that happened often for use in fertilizer or even charcoal. Imagine sitting in a stuffy committee room and someone whips out a jar of really unpleasant-smelling dirt and declares, "This, gentleman, is what your constituents are breathing." It certainly would have made an impact, albeit a rather stomach-churning one. Despite the setbacks, the reformers kept pushing. The recurring outbreaks of disease like the cholera epidemics we touched upon served as grim reinforcement of their warnings. Each time sickness swept through the city, the arguments about the dangers of overcrowded burial grounds gained renewed urgency. The miasma theory, even if scientifically flawed, provided a compelling, understandable link between the visible decay in the graveyards and the terrifying, invisible spread of illness. Historians still argue whether the driving force behind the eventual cemetery reforms was primarily the fear of disease as promoted by the public health campaigners, or if it was the sheer logistical impossibility of burying more people in the existing space, coupled with changing aesthetic sensibilities that preferred tranquil park-like cemeteries over chaotic urban burial pits. Was it primarily a health crisis solution or a city planning necessity dressed up in public health urgency? It's hard to disentangle the threads as all these factors, health, space economics, aesthetics, and dignity, were intertwined and mutually reinforcing the need for change. The reformers were savvy enough to use all these arguments, appealing to different concerns within society and parliament. So the groundwork was laid not just by the problem itself, but by the dedicated efforts of individuals and commissions who systematically documented the issues, articulated the dangers, and refused to let the problem be ignored. They educated the public-pressured politicians and kept the spotlight firmly on the overflowing, unsanitary, and undignified state of London's burial grounds. Their persistence, combined with the undeniable reality on the ground and the occasional terrifying reminder of mortality in the form of an epidemic, gradually built the momentum required to finally overcome the resistance and clear the path for radical solutions. So the pressure was building, fueled by reformers' reports, and the simple, undeniable reality that the old ways weren't just inconvenient anymore, they were dangerous and deeply unpleasant. The stage was set for a fundamental shift, a move away from the cramped, often chaotic churchyards that were literally overflowing towards something entirely new. This wasn't just about finding somewhere else to put the dead. It was about reimagining the entire concept of a burial ground. Enter the garden cemetery movement. The idea wasn't entirely novel globally. Places like Paris had already started establishing large landscape cemeteries like Père Lachaise, which opened in the early 19th century. But London was a bit slower on the uptake, perhaps hampered by those very traditions and financial interests the reformers had to fight against. When it did happen, though, it happened big. The solution, when it finally arrived with the force of legislation and private enterprise, was to build large purpose-built cemeteries on the outskirts of the rapidly expanding city. These weren't grim, muddy fields. These were designed as beautiful park-like spaces intended not just for burial, but also for quiet contemplation, respectful visiting, and even surprisingly, as places of recreation. Imagine that. Your weekend stroll takes you past elaborate mausoleums and weeping angels instead of squirrels and park benches. A little morbid perhaps, but certainly more spacious than your average city square at the time. Between the 1830s and the 1840s, 7 major commercial cemeteries were established around the perimeter of London. These are famously known today as the Magnificent Seven. Think of them as the first wave of industrial-scale death management, but make it picturesque. They were Kensal Green West, Norwood Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead Brompton, and Tower Hamlets. Each was developed by a private company seeing a clear market need and a potentially lucrative business in the burial crisis. The design philosophy was a deliberate contrast to the old churchyards. Instead of higgledy-piggledy graves crammed together, these new cemeteries featured wide avenues, winding paths, carefully planted trees, shrubs and flowers, and impressive architectural features like chapels, catacombs, and elaborate entrance gates. They were often situated on elevated ground, offering views, and were enclosed by walls or railings, giving them a sense of separation from the bustling, dirty city. Stepping inside was meant to be a transition, a move from the profane chaos of urban life to a sacred, tranquil space dedicated to memory and mourning. You'd arrive perhaps in a horse-drawn carriage procession, winding its way out of the city, or later even by a special funeral train. Yes, that was a thing. Imagine your final journey being on a dedicated railway line, straight to the cemetery gates. Talk about a one-way ticket. The air would be cleaner, the sounds muted, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. You wouldn't trip over unmarked mounds or breathe in noxious fumes. The ground would be neat ordered with space between graves. It must have felt like stepping into another world compared to the nightmares the reformers had been describing. Mainstream historical fact time. The catalyst for the first of the Magnificent Seven Kensal Green Cemetery was the General Cemetery Act of 1832. This act incorporated the General Cemetery Company, a private venture specifically created to establish a large cemetery outside central London. This set the precedent for private enterprise stepping in to solve a major public health and logistical problem, paving the way for the other 6 to follow suit over the next decade or so, funded by shareholders who were essentially betting on death continuing to be a reliable business. These new cemeteries quickly became fashionable burial places, particularly for the middle and upper classes, who could afford the plots and the elaborate monuments. Suddenly, where you were buried and the size and style of your tombstone became another form of social signaling. Wealthy families commissioned grand mausoleums, intricate sculptures by famous artists, and impressive obelisks. Visiting the cemetery became a social activity, a place to be seen as well as to mourn. Imagine a Sunday afternoon stroll where you admire Mrs. Higgins' particularly large marble angel, while secretly judging the slightly too small urn on the next plot over. Because even in death, Victorian society loved a bit of subtle competition. The move to these out-of-town locations also required new logistics. As mentioned, special funeral trains ran from central London, termini out to cemeteries like Brompton and Brookwood, though Brookwood came a bit later and was even further out, earning it the nickname London Necropolis. You'd board a train specifically designed for the purpose, sometimes with different classes of carriage for the living mourners, and a dedicated hearse van for the coffin. It sounds slightly surreal, but it was a practical necessity. No more hauling the deceased through crowded city streets for miles. Let the railway do the heavy lifting. Here's a quirky tidbit. Highgate Cemetery, perhaps the most famous today, thanks to its atmospheric West Cemetery and famous residents like Karl Marx in the East Cemetery, actually had a waiting list for desirable plots even in its early years. People were planning their eternal resting places with the same kind of strategic thinking they might apply to buying a house or securing a good seat at the opera. Some plots came with specific rights like permission to build a family vault or mausoleum, adding to their exclusivity and cost. It was the ultimate real estate market. Plots you'd literally never leave. While the garden cemeteries offered a beautiful and spacious alternative, they didn't immediately solve the problem for everyone. The poor still largely relied on overcrowded parish burial grounds or pauper sections in the new cemeteries, which often lacked the landscaping and dignity of the wealthier areas. The legislation enabling these new cemeteries also didn't immediately close the old churchyards, though restrictions were gradually put in place later. So it was a significant step forward, but not an overnight fix for the entire system. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the private companies establishing these cemeteries was genuinely philanthropic, responding to a public health crisis, or purely economic, recognizing a profitable business opportunity created by that crisis. Was it a case of doing good by doing well, or simply shrewd entrepreneurs capitalizing on a desperate situation? The truth is likely a complex mix of both, as the companies did provide a necessary service and create beautiful spaces, while undoubtedly aiming to make a healthy return for their shareholders. So the era of the overflowing urban burial ground began to wane, slowly replaced by the rise of the serene landscape garden cemetery. It was a practical solution to a pressing problem, yes, but it also reflected changing attitudes towards death and mourning, offering a sense of peace, dignity, and even beauty in the face of mortality, far removed from the grim realities of the past century's burial practices. You could finally visit your dearly departed without worrying about stepping on someone else's grandma or inhaling questionable fumes. Progress. So while the private sector, bless its profit-driven heart, stepped in and built these rather lovely, albeit expensive parks for the dead, remember how we talked about the poor still struggling, how the old churchyards didn't magically empty out and become lovely gardens just because Highgate was accepting new residents if they could afford the rent. Yeah, that problem persisted. The Magnificent Seven were a relief valve, not a complete fix for a city that was literally bursting at the seams with both the living and the recently departed. The sheer scale of mortality in a booming metropolis like Victorian London meant that even with 7 vast new cemeteries, the demand for burial space was still astronomical, and the access to that space remained deeply unequal. This inequality, coupled with the ongoing, undeniable public health nightmare of the inner-city churchyards, the ones everyone conveniently ignored if they could afford to, started to build pressure for more comprehensive action. It wasn't enough for the wealthy and middle classes to have somewhere nice to be buried. The state eventually had to step in and address the problem for everyone. The private companies had shown that large-scale cemeteries were feasible and could be managed, but their model didn't serve the whole population. And let's be honest, relying purely on market forces to handle the disposal of dead bodies when you're dealing with mass urban mortality probably wasn't the brightest long-term strategy anyway. You can't exactly have a clearance sale on caskets when there's a cholera outbreak. This is where the state finally started to get serious, moving beyond the rather half-hearted and ultimately failed Metropolis Interment Act of 1850 we touched upon earlier. The real legislative punch came in the early 1850s with a series of crucial burial acts. These acts were game changers. They acknowledged that providing adequate sanitary burial space was a matter of public health and local government responsibility, not just a private business opportunity. They empowered parishes and municipal boroughs to form burial boards, acquire land, and establish their own public cemeteries. Crucially, they also gave these boards the power to close down the old, overcrowded, and unsanitary churchyards and burial grounds within their areas, especially in London. Imagine the scene after decades of dithering debate and watching the private sector take the lead. Local authorities were suddenly mandated and empowered to actually do something. These weren't profit-driven ventures looking for picturesque locations. These were public works projects aimed at sanitation and space. The sites chosen were often less grand than the private cemeteries, maybe flatter, less undulating land, perhaps further out in the suburbs or just beyond the immediate urban sprawl, but crucially, they were large and designated for public use. They weren't always as beautifully landscaped initially, often starting out as fairly simple open fields, marked with rows upon rows of graves, but they provided space and they were accessible. A key feature of these public cemeteries was the provision for all classes. While there might still be different sections and options for monuments depending on what a family could afford, there were mandatory provisions for pauper funerals and burials. This meant that even the poorest residents, those who couldn't dream of affording a plot in Highgate or Kensal Green, could be buried in a dedicated, albeit simple plot in a public cemetery. This was a massive step towards basic human dignity in death for the vast majority of Londoners who live precarious, working-class lives. The stark contrast between the ornate mausoleums of the wealthy and the simple earth mounds in the pauper sections of these new public grounds was a poignant reflection of societal divisions. But at least everyone had a place to be buried that wasn't on top of three other people in a festering churchyard. Mainstream historical fact. The Burial Act of 1852 and the subsequent Burial Act of 1853 were particularly significant. The 1852 Act established the principle of empowering local burial boards, while the 1853 Act, following a severe cholera outbreak and growing public outcry, gave the Home Secretary powers to order the closing of overcrowded burial grounds in London. These acts directly led to the establishment of numerous large municipal cemeteries across the capital, and country shifting the burden and responsibility from individual parishes and private companies to local government. This legislative push marked a clear pivot towards a more public planned approach to urban death management. It wasn't just about tidying up, it was about containing disease and providing essential infrastructure. The closure of the old churchyards, while necessary, wasn't without its challenges or controversies. For centuries, these had been the spiritual and social heart of communities. Suddenly, families couldn't bury their loved ones in the same hallowed ground as generations passed. Existing gravestones were sometimes moved or simply covered over as new soil was laid. It required a huge logistical effort and significant funding from the newly formed burial boards. And imagine the bureaucratic headache, forming boards, acquiring land, often through compulsory purchase, designing layout, hiring staff. It was a monumental undertaking for local governments that were still developing their capacity to manage such large-scale infrastructure projects. Think about the practicalities for the poor. If a burial board closed their local churchyard, where did they go? The new public cemeteries were often miles away. This meant costs for transporting the body, perhaps hiring a simple cart, or even carrying it a long distance if funds were tight. Funeral practices for the poor often involve friends and neighbors carrying the coffin, a poignant display of community support, but physically demanding over long distances. The new public cemeteries, while accessible in terms of plot cost, still presented logistical hurdles for the poorest families, highlighting that even state intervention couldn't erase the challenges of poverty entirely. Still, it was better than the indignities of the old system. Here's a quirky tidbit. When the old churchyards were finally closed, many of them were eventually converted into public gardens or parks. This was a conscious effort to reclaim the land and provide much-needed green space in dense urban areas. However, you were basically walking and picnicking on centuries of human remains, just with a few feet of soil on top. Some headstones were left in place around the edges, others were stacked up or used in landscaping features. So next time you're strolling through a quiet green space in an old part of London, take a moment to consider whose eternal rest you might be disturbing. It's the ultimate in repurposing land, I suppose. From overcrowded charnel house to a pleasant spot for your lunch break, quite the transformation. Probably gives the pigeons something interesting to peck at too. Historians still argue whether the burial acts were primarily a response to public health crises, like cholera outbreaks, or whether they were driven more by changing social attitudes towards death and burial, or even a combination of both. Was the main motivation fear of disease spreading from churchyards, or a growing sense that all citizens, regardless of class, deserved a dignified and sanitary resting place? The timing coinciding with periods of high mortality and increasing awareness of sanitation issues certainly points towards public health as a major driver, but the rhetoric of dignity and respect for the dead was also a powerful force. It's hard to untangle the threads of fear, philanthropy, and public duty. These public cemeteries, established under the authority of local government, represented a fundamental shift. Death and burial for millennia, largely the domain of the church, and then briefly a focus for private enterprise, became a matter of public utility. This move mirrored broader trends in Victorian Britain, where the state was gradually taking on more responsibility for public welfare, sanitation, and infrastructure in response to the challenges of rapid industrialization and urbanization. Providing cemeteries was seen as just as essential as providing clean water or basic sewage systems, albeit perhaps slightly less glamorous. The landscaping in these public grounds, while not always as elaborate as the winding paths and specimen trees of the Magnificent Seven, often followed similar principles of providing open, airy spaces. There were main avenues, chapels often simpler, more functional buildings, and sections laid out in grid patterns. While the private cemeteries catered to the individual desire for ornate memorials and picturesque settings, the public cemeteries prioritized capacity hygiene and democratic access. They were the workhorses of urban burial, handling the vast majority of the dead from the working and lower middle classes. They were the places where the city's sheer mortality rate was absorbed quietly and systematically, ensuring that the problems of overcrowding and unsanitary conditions were finally truly brought under control, at least for the main part. The landscape of death in London was irrevocably changed, marked by the rise of these large, planned, and publicly accessible burial grounds, a testament to the fact that sometimes you just need the government to step in and sort things out. Even something as morbid as running out of places to put bodies. You know, when you think about the private cemeteries, the Magnificent Seven we talked about, you picture rolling hills, grand avenues lined with impressive monuments, maybe a creepy cat or two lurking near a mausoleum. They were designed in part to be aspirational. Places where you not only buried your dead, but where the living could stroll, reflect, and admire the wealth and status of the departed, or at least their surviving families. They were the garden estates for the dead, a stark contrast to the cramped, chaotic churchyards they were supposed to replace. But the public cemeteries, the ones established under the Burial Acts and managed by local boards, had a different brief entirely. Their design wasn't primarily about creating a picturesque landscape or a status symbol. It was about solving a pressing public health crisis and a logistical nightmare efficiently and affordably for the masses. If the private cemeteries were the ornate, slightly spooky Victorian country houses, the public cemeteries were the municipal housing blocks, functional, necessary, and built for scale. Their layouts were often much more rectilinear, based on grids rather than winding paths. While there might be a central avenue or two, the dominant pattern was rows upon rows of plots neatly arranged and numbered. This wasn't for aesthetic pleasure, it was for efficiency. Imagine trying to find a specific grave among tens of thousands in a system designed purely for maximum capacity. A grid is practical. It allows for systematic surveying, plotting, and management of individual grave spaces. It's the spreadsheet approach to burial, you might say. Less poetic, certainly, but incredibly effective when you're trying to bury tens of thousands of people a year in a growing city. The chapels in these public grounds also tended to be less grand than their private counterparts. While the private cemeteries might boast elaborate Gothic or Egyptian-inspired structures for their nonconformist and Anglican chapels, because even in death, Victorian Britain loved a bit of architectural segregation. The public cemetery chapels were often simpler, more utilitarian buildings. They served their purpose, providing a space for a brief service before the committal, without the architectural flourishes intended to impress. They were functional rooms rather than statements of eternal glory. This reflected the difference in funding and purpose. Public funds raised through local rates demanded a more frugal approach than private capital, seeking a return on investment even in the afterlife infrastructure. Landscaping followed the same principle. While there might be some tree planting along main avenues and around the chapels, you weren't likely to find the rare specimen trees, the elaborate shrubbery mazes, or the carefully sculpted lakes and follies that characterized the more ambitious private cemeteries. The goal was open space air circulation and ease of access to plots, not creating a romantic ruse in urbi for mourning families. Paths were often wider, designed for the efficient movement of hearses and funeral processions, even on busy days. The overall feel was one of necessary infrastructure, like a waterworks or a gas plant, albeit one dealing with human remains. It was about quantity and sanitation over quality of serene experience. Not exactly the place for a Sunday picnic, unless you really like quiet and contemplating mortality on a mass scale. Think about the sheer numbers these places had to absorb. The closure of inner-city churchyards meant a sudden massive demand for burial space that the existing private cemeteries, even the Magnificent Seven, couldn't fully meet, especially for the working classes. The public cemeteries were designed from the ground up to handle volume. They were often established on much larger tracts of land further out from the urban center areas that were cheaper to acquire and offered ample space for expansion. This outward migration of the dead mirrored the outward migration of the living into the new suburbs that were rapidly developing around the city. Death like life was following the railway lines and new roads away from the congested core. Managing these public cemeteries required significant administrative effort. Burial boards had to be formed, staff hired, grave diggers, registrars, sextons, and detailed records kept of every single burial. This was crucial for public health. Knowing who was buried where and ensuring plots were responsibly used without disturbing earlier interments prematurely. The old churchyards were notorious for poor record keeping and disturbances of earlier burials simply because there was no space. The new public cemeteries implemented systematic plot numbering and registration systems. It was less about preserving family history in perpetuity and more about managing the municipal inventory of dead bodies. Efficiency wasn't just a design choice, it was a necessity. Mainstream historical fact. By the late Victorian period following the key burial acts of the 1850s, hundreds of municipal cemeteries had been established across Britain, not just in London, but in every major town and city, facing similar problems of urban growth and overcrowded burial grounds. These public cemeteries rapidly became the primary place of burial for the majority of the population, fundamentally altering the geography and practice of death for the working and middle classes. They represented a nationwide shift in responsibility for burial from the church and private enterprise to local government, a significant step in the development of municipal services and public health infrastructure. The sheer scale of these public cemeteries could be overwhelming. Imagine walking through acres upon acres of relatively uniform headstones, or even just simple numbered markers. While families could erect monuments, they were often more modest than those found in the private grounds, limited by cost and sometimes by cemetery regulations that encourage a degree of uniformity to maximize space. The landscape could feel more open, even bleak, especially in newer sections where trees hadn't matured. It lacked the enclosed secret garden feel of some of the private cemeteries. You felt the vastness of urban mortality laid bare rather than death hidden away in picturesque groves. It was the industrialization of burial in a sense, processing large numbers efficiently. Probably not the vibe you'd aim for on a first date unless you're really into existential dread and spreadsheets. There's a quirky tidbit about the grave diggers in these public cemeteries. With the sheer volume of burials, grave digging became a professionalized, often family trade passed down through generations. It was incredibly hard physical labor, digging by hand through potentially difficult ground in all weather. But these workers developed a deep practical knowledge of the soil, the cemetery layout, and the logistics of interment. They often had macabre humor and fascinating, sometimes unsettling stories about their work. Some even moonlighted by offering services like straightening leaning gravestones or locating specific plots for distant relatives, developing a personal connection to the vast landscapes they worked within, often literally knowing the ground like the back of their hand or shovel. They were the unsung heroes, or perhaps just deeply pragmatic employees keeping the system running. Historians still argue whether the development of distinct public and private cemeteries exacerbated or merely reflected existing class divisions in Victorian society. Did the creation of separate burial spaces reinforce social stratification, even in death? Or were they simply a necessary pragmatic response to different needs and economic realities, providing adequate space where none existed before, regardless of class? While the public cemeteries offered dignity and sanitation to those who couldn't afford the private grounds. The visual contrast between the opulent memorials of the wealthy and the simple plots of the poor in the public sections remained a potent symbol of inequality even 6 feet under. It's a debate about whether the state intervention was about leveling the playing field or just providing a baseline minimum service. The regulations within public cemeteries could also differ. While private cemeteries often had complex rules about monument size, style, and even material, public cemeteries might have simpler, more standardized options or stricter limitations to ensure plots could be easily accessed and maintained. They were less about individual expression and more about collective order and functionality. The emphasis was on ensuring a final resting place was available for everyone, even if it wasn't a highly customized or elaborate one. This governmental approach to burial was a significant departure from centuries of tradition where burial rights were tied to the church and community or later driven by private investment. Consider the economics from the perspective of the burial boards. They had to balance the costs of acquiring land, laying it out, staffing the grounds, maintaining paths and drainage, and providing for pauper burials, all funded by local rates or fees that had to be affordable for the working classes. This meant tough choices about where to spend money, functionality over aesthetics, capacity over elaborate design. It was a massive logistical and financial undertaking for local authorities, one that required new systems of administration and public works management. It's easy to forget that managing death on this scale required a whole new municipal bureaucracy dedicated just to getting bodies into the ground in an orderly fashion. A bureaucracy of the buried, if you will. Sounds like a thrilling career path, right? So what do you do? Oh, I manage dead people traffic flow. The rise of these public cemeteries fundamentally changed the landscape of death in urban areas. They were vast, often located on the periphery, and designed primarily for efficiency and capacity. They absorbed the majority of the dead from a rapidly growing, largely working-class population. While they lacked the romantic, picturesque charm of the private cemeteries, they provided essential infrastructure that solved a critical public health problem and offered a degree of dignity in death that had become impossible in the overcrowded churchyards. They were the backbone of the Victorian burial system, processing the sheer volume of mortality with systematic purpose. They might not feature in spooky ghost stories as often as the older grounds, but their impact on Victorian life and death was far more widespread and profound. They were the quiet, sprawling testament to a city that finally found a way to cope with the sheer number of its departed citizens, not through grand gestures, but through pragmatic planning and municipal will, and lots of graves. So you've got these vast new landscapes of death, the picturesque private estates, and the sprawling, functional public grounds. But they weren't just repositories for the dead, they became integral parts of Victorian life for the living. After the solemn procession wound its way through the gates after the earth had been turned, and the final prayers said life wasn't over, in many ways, a new relationship with the deceased and with the place of their rest was just beginning. You didn't just bury someone and forget about them. You visited them. Imagine yourself perhaps a few days or a week after the funeral, dressed in somber attire, or at least something dark and respectable, depending on your means and the strictness of your mourning. You make the journey out to the cemetery. If it's one of the older churchyards, it might be a short, familiar walk through the city streets. But if it's one of these new expansive cemeteries, it's likely a more significant trip. Perhaps a carriage ride, a tram journey, or even a walk lasting an hour or more, especially if you're heading to the larger public grounds further out. The journey itself becomes part of the ritual, a physical separation from the bustle of daily life as you move towards the realm of the departed. As you pass through those grand gates, or perhaps the more modest turnstiles of a public ground, the atmosphere shifts. The noise of the city begins to fade, replaced by a relative quiet broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot. The rustling of leaves, maybe the distant call of a bird. The air often feels cooler perhaps, tinged with the scent of damp earth, cut grass, and the faint, sometimes overwhelming perfume of flowers left on graves. You walk along the winding paths of the private cemeteries or the straight numbered avenues of the public ones, scanning the rows of monuments, searching for the familiar shape of a headstone, a cross, or a simple marker. It's like a strange, melancholy treasure hunt across a vast, silent landscape. Finding the grave involves navigating this ordered, or sometimes less ordered, if you're in an older section, or it's been a while, city of the dead. You remember the plot number, perhaps you have a little map, or maybe you just know the landmarks. Just past the big angel statue, take a left at the Weeping Willow 4 rows back. As you approach, the personal connection sharpens. This isn't just another marker, it's theirs. You stand before the stone, perhaps reaching out to touch the cool, unyielding surface, tracing the carved letters of their name, their birth, and death dates. It's a tangible point of connection in a world where their physical presence is gone. What do you do there? You talk to them, of course. You tell them about your day-share family news, express your grief, your longing, your hopes. It's a one-sided conversation, but deeply cathartic. You might straighten a fallen flower, brush away leaves, or simply stand in silent contemplation. For many Victorians, especially women, these cemetery visits became a regular pilgrimage. Weekly, monthly, or on significant anniversaries like birthdays or the date of death. It was an active form of mourning, a way to keep the memory alive, and to process grief over the long term. It wasn't just about the initial outburst of sorrow, it was about sustained remembrance. Tending the grave was also a significant activity, a way to show continued care and devotion. People would plant flowers, trim the grass around the plot, and clean the monument. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about marking the space, making it beautiful, making it theirs in this communal ground. You might bring a small trowel and gloves bags of seeds or bulbs, and spend an hour or two carefully cultivating the small patch of earth above your loved one. Imagine the satisfaction, or perhaps the bittersweet solace, of seeing new life sprout from the ground that holds death. It was a quiet act of creation in the face of ultimate loss, a small garden carved out of the larger necropolis. This constant upkeep also helped the cemetery management, effectively outsourcing some of the maintenance to the bereaved families. Clever, right? You pay for the plot and then you do the gardening too. Win-win. For the cemetery board anyway. But these cemeteries weren't always purely solitary places of quiet mourning. Especially in the larger, more park-like private cemeteries, they became destinations for the living, even those not directly visiting a specific grave. The Magnificent Seven were designed with wide avenues, landscape gardens, and impressive architecture, specifically to attract visitors and serve as places of public promenade and recreation. People would stroll through the grounds admiring the monuments, which were often miniature works of art or architecture, enjoying the greenery and escaping the crowded, polluted streets of the city. It was a form of leisure, albeit one tinged with the omnipresent reminder of mortality. Sunday afternoons in particular became a popular time for cemetery visits, often a family affair. You might see groups of people dressed in their Sunday best, walking together, children, sometimes playing quietly or less quietly, depending on the parents' tolerance for desecrating the sanctity of the dead with youthful exuberance along the paths. It was a social outing. You might encounter neighbors, acquaintances, or even strangers. People would sometimes compare monuments, discuss the grandeur of certain memorials, or simply enjoy the relative peace and quiet compared to other public spaces. Cemeteries perhaps unexpectedly became part of the urban social fabric, albeit a distinct and somewhat somber thread. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of people watching in a park, but with more statues of grieving angels and fewer pigeons, though pigeons were probably still a problem. Mainstream historical fact visiting cemeteries, particularly on Sundays, became a widespread social custom in Victorian Britain, especially after the establishment of the large landscape suburban cemeteries. These grounds offered a quiet, often beautiful space for recreation and contemplation, away from the increasingly crowded and polluted urban centers, transforming the act of remembrance into a public ritual interwoven with leisure activity. The social performance of mourning was also played out in these spaces. The scale and elaborateness of a family's monument, the frequency of their visits, and the adherence to mourning dress codes were all visible markers of status, respectability, and the depth of their grief, or at least the depth of their willingness to publicly perform grief. A grand mausoleum or an intricately carved obelisk spoke volumes about the wealth and position of the deceased and their family. Even the type of flowers planted could signify social standing. While public cemeteries aimed for more egalitarian access, the disparities in wealth were still starkly visible in the type and quality of the memorials erected within them. You could tell a lot about a family's balance sheet by looking at the size of their gravestone. Ah, yes, the humble pebble signifies, well, let's just say they won't be needing a bigger boat. There were also more specific, sometimes unusual social rituals associated with these spaces. For example, on certain holidays like Easter or All Souls Day, some communities would gather in larger numbers, almost turning the cemeteries into temporary villages of remembrance. In some working-class communities, particularly those with strong traditions brought from rural areas, burial clubs or friendly societies might have collective plots or specific rituals associated with the interment and subsequent care of their members. These weren't just places for individual or family grief. They were also spaces where community bonds were reinforced, sometimes in very structured ways. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some people use the relative privacy and quiet of the cemeteries for activities completely unrelated to mourning. While ostensibly places of somber reflection, the vastness of the grounds and their often isolated locations on the city's periphery meant they could be used for clandestine meetings, quiet picnics, though this was often frowned upon depending on the specific cemetery's rules and the prevailing social norms, or even as shortcuts between areas of the growing suburbs. Imagine a couple having a romantic rendezvous tucked away behind a large monument, while just a few yards away, a family is weeping over a freshly dug grave. A bit morbid perhaps, but it highlights how these spaces were integrated, sometimes awkwardly, into the diverse lives of the living. They weren't hermetically sealed off. Life in all its messy forms found its way in. Historians still argue whether the increasing visibility of death and its associated rituals in these large cemeteries, contrasting with the older, more confined churchyards, made Victorian society more or less comfortable with mortality. Did the regular visits, the elaborate monuments, and the integration of cemeteries into leisure activities signify a healthy engagement with death as a natural part of life? Or did it instead point to a morbid fascination, a performative grief that masked a deeper discomfort or denial? It's a debate about the sincerity versus the spectacle of Victorian mourning and how these dedicated landscapes influence that complex relationship. The sheer volume of visitors, particularly on Sundays, meant that cemeteries required significant management beyond just burying people. Paths had to be maintained, rules enforced no picnicking on graves, thank you very much, unless you brought enough for everyone. Just kidding, don't do that, and security provided to prevent vandalism or other inappropriate activities. Some cemeteries even had guides or published maps to help visitors navigate the grounds and locate specific plots or notable monuments. It was a whole ecosystem centered around the dead, but populated and managed by the living. The monuments themselves became a form of public art and a record of Victorian beliefs and aesthetics. You'd see everything from classical urns and obelisks to Gothic crosses, weeping angels, and elaborate sarcophagi. The symbolism was rich. Broken columns signifying a life cut short anchors, representing hope ivy for fidelity, doves for peace. Even relatively simple headstones often featured intricate carvings or meaningful epitaphs. Walking through a Victorian cemetery today is like reading a stone-carved history book, not just of individuals, but of the artistic tastes, religious beliefs, and social values of the time. It's a testament to the desire across social classes to leave a lasting mark to be remembered physically in a designated space. Children growing up in Victorian cities would have been familiar with cemeteries. They weren't necessarily seen as terrifying places to be avoided at all costs, but rather as part of the urban landscape. Perhaps you played near the edges, perhaps you visited with your family, perhaps you were tasked with helping tend a relative's grave. These early exposures would have shaped their understanding of death and remembrance. While death was ever present in Victorian life, high infant mortality, infectious diseases, the cemetery provided a specific designated space for engaging with it publicly and ritually separate from the domestic sphere, where much of the dying often occurred. Consider the sensory experience again. Beyond the sights and sounds, there was the feeling of the rough stone of a monument, the soft soil of a grave plot, the bite of the wind across an open field, the dappled sunlight filtering through trees. These were multi-sensory environments designed intentionally or not to evoke certain feelings. Solemnity, peace, remembrance, even a sense of connection to nature and the cycles of life and death. They offered a structured space for grief, a place to perform sorrow and remembrance in a way that was socially acceptable and even encouraged. It was a necessary outlet in a society where death was common, but perhaps public emotional displays outside of designated rituals were less so. In a way, the cemeteries became miniature cities themselves, with their own avenues, districts sometimes informally divided by class or denomination, notable landmarks. The grandest mausoleums and a transient population of visitors constantly moving through them. They mirrored the city they served, housing its permanent residents, the dead, and welcoming its temporary inhabitants, the mourners and strollers. This blurring of the lines between the city of the living and the city of the dead was a distinctive feature of Victorian urban life, made possible by the creation of these dedicated, expansive burial grounds. They weren't just disposal sites, they were active, vibrant, in a quiet, mournful way. Components of the urban ecosystem shaping social practices, leisure habits, and the very landscape of memory. It's hard to imagine modern urban life incorporating death so physically and regularly into public spaces, unless it's maybe a particularly spooky Halloween attraction, which, let's be honest, Victorian cemeteries already kind of are, minus the entry fee and the fake cobwebs. And so these fields of stone and earth became more than just graves. They became destinations parks, social hubs and stages for the performance of grief and remembrance. They were where the living continued their relationship with the dead, where social status was etched in stone, and where the quiet rhythms of upkeep and visitation became a regular, almost mundane part of the urban week. They were the places where death was not just hidden away, but integrated, visited, tended, and remembered, fundamentally changing how Victorians interacted with their dearly and sometimes not so dearly departed. As you walk through these landscapes of remembrance, these cities of the dead, your eyes are inevitably drawn upward, scanning the horizon of stone and marble, wood, and iron. It's not just the sheer number of markers that captures your attention, but their incredible variety. While the grassy plots and winding paths set the stage, the monuments are the main characters in this silent play of memory and status. They rise from the earth, each one a statement, a symbol, a testament, not just to the person buried beneath, but to the family left behind, their wealth, their taste, their aspirations, and their very specific interpretation of grief and remembrance in Victorian society. Remember back in those overcrowded churchyards, the markers there were often simple crowded, sometimes barely legible slabs, leaning precariously against each other. Here in the spacious grounds of the new cemeteries, the monuments have room to breathe, to declare themselves to dominate their little patch of consecrated ground, and they take full advantage of it. You see everything from modest headstones, upright slabs of granite or marble, to imposing crosses, towering obelisks, miniature temples, and even elaborate mausoleums that look more like small houses or chapels than places of rest for the dead. The choice of monument was deeply significant, reflecting not just the family's budget, which, let's be honest, was a pretty big factor, but also their religious beliefs, their social class, and even their personality or that of the deceased. Granite was popular for its durability, a practical choice for ensuring the memorial lasted for generations. Marble, though softer and more prone to weathering and acid rain, which was becoming a real problem in industrial cities, was prized for its purity and the ease with which it could be intricately carved, allowing for delicate details like lace on an angel's gown or the veins on a leaf. Sandstone was cheaper but less durable, often crumbling over time, leaving many older markers illegible today. Iron was sometimes used for crosses or decorative railings around plots, adding another layer of material texture and visual interest. Consider the sheer variety of forms. The simple upright headstone, often topped with a curved or pointed arch, was the most common, the backbone of the cemetery landscape. Then came the crosses, ranging from plain Latin crosses to more ornate Celtic or Gothic designs reflecting strong Christian faith. Obelisks inspired by ancient Egypt became surprisingly popular in the Victorian era, perhaps symbolizing a connection to eternity or a desire for timeless grandeur. These often stood tall and imposing mini Washington monuments scattered across the landscape, definitely making a statement about the importance of the person buried below. Yup, Uncle Reginald was a big deal. We got him a pointy rock the size of a small tree. Then there are the more architecturally ambitious structures. Pedestals topped with urns symbolizing mourning, or sometimes the receptacle for ashes, though cremation was still rare. Broken columns representing a life cut short or intricately carved sculptures. Often allegorical figures like grief, faith, or hope, or sometimes portraits of the deceased or angels. Weeping angels are particularly iconic Victorian cemetery residents, often draped in flowing robes, their faces hidden or turned away in sorrow, perched atop or beside a tomb. They evoke a strong sense of melancholy and provide a powerful visual representation of sorrow. And let's not forget the sarcophagi, stone coffins, placed above ground, often heavily decorated, directly referencing classical antiquity and adding another layer of historical weight and perceived importance. At the apex of the monumental hierarchy were the mausoleums. These were essentially private miniature buildings designed to house one or multiple burials, often above ground. They range from simple stone boxes with a door to elaborate multi-room structures with stained glass windows, carved doors, and internal chambers. Building a mausoleum wasn't just about burying someone. It was about creating a permanent, prominent landmark, a family monument that would stand for centuries, declaring the family's enduring presence and status. They were the ultimate status symbol in death, shouting, We were rich and we stayed rich enough to build a tiny palace for our bones. You'd find these scattered throughout the private cemeteries, often occupying prime locations along the main avenues or on hilltops ensuring maximum visibility. In the public cemeteries, where plots were smaller and often more uniform grand, mausoleums were less common, but larger family plots with substantial monuments still marked significant social differences. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian grave monuments ranging from simple headstones to elaborate mausoleums and sculptures served as significant indicators of social status and wealth, reflecting the intense class consciousness of the era and transforming cemeteries into visible landscapes of social hierarchy as well as remembrance. The symbolism carved into these stones formed a complex visual language that would have been widely understood or at least recognized by Victorians. A lamb often marked the grave of a child, symbolizing innocence. An anchor represented hope, particularly the Christian hope of salvation. Ivy signified fidelity, friendship, and eternal life. Roses, depending on whether they were budding in full bloom or broken, could symbolize youth maturity or a life cut short. Hands clasped together symbolized a final farewell or the enduring bond of marriage. A torch turned downwards represented extinguished life, while an upright torch symbolized eternal life. Wheat or grapes might reference communion and resurrection. Even common plants carved into the stone carried meaning. Ferns for humility, poppies for eternal sleep. Decoding a Victorian grave was like reading a poem written in the stone and flora. But the symbolism wasn't just for religious or sentimental purposes. It also reinforced social norms and roles. Monuments for men might feature symbols of their profession or public life, while those for women often focused on domestic virtues, piety, or their role as wives and mothers, even if they'd had other significant roles. Children's graves were frequently adorned with broken flowers, lambs, or cherubic figures, emphasizing their purity and premature loss. These monuments in their design and decoration perpetuated and displayed the era's rigid social structure and gender roles, literally carving them into the landscape of death. The sheer artistry involved in creating these monuments was considerable. Stonemasons, carvers, and sculptors were in high demand, forming a significant industry centered around cemeteries. Workshops would be located near the larger grounds, displaying examples of their work and offering catalogs of designs. Wealthier families could commission unique bespoke pieces from renowned sculptors, turning a gravesite into a work of art that might attract visitors on its own merit. You'd pore over these catalogs, choosing the right weeping angel or the most dignified obelisk, presumably, while trying not to think too much about the recipient. Yes, I think Aunt Mildred would have preferred the classical urn, though the Gothic cross does say pious. Decisions. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to monuments is the occasional use of materials that seem utterly bizarre today. For instance, in some areas, graves were marked with large chunks of industrial slag, the waste product of smelting, or even large pieces of machinery parts, particularly in manufacturing towns. These weren't elaborate sculptures, but rather raw, symbolic markers referencing the industry that dominated the lives and sometimes caused the deaths of the community. It's a stark contrast to the refined marble angels and speaks to a different, more direct way of marking identity and loss, rooted in the harsh realities of industrial labor rather than idealized classical or religious forms. Imagine visiting a grave marked by a giant rusting gear, a visceral reminder of the dangers of the factory floor carried into the stillness of the cemetery. Historians still argue whether the increasing elaborateness and personalization of monuments in Victorian cemeteries represented a genuine deepening of personal grief and remembrance, or was primarily a form of conspicuous consumption, a way for families to display their wealth and social standing in a public space, using death as an opportunity for social competition. Were people genuinely investing in stone to honor their loved ones? Or were they investing in social capital, ensuring their family name literally stood tall among their peers? It's difficult to untangle the sincere emotions from the performative aspects in a society so obsessed with status and appearances, and the monuments themselves offer evidence for both interpretations. Was that massive granite obelisk a heartfelt tribute or just stone-cold showing off? Probably a bit of both, depending on the family. The placement of monuments within the cemetery also mattered. As mentioned before, prime spots along main avenues or with good views were more expensive and desirable, typically occupied by wealthier families and their grandest memorials. Poorer sections of the cemetery might feature rows of smaller, simpler headstones, or even just numbered markers or shared memorials for multiple unrelated individuals buried in common graves. Walking through a Victorian cemetery was a visual journey through the social strata of the city it served, written in stone. The good neighborhoods were just as visible here as they were in the city itself. Maintaining these monuments was another ongoing task and expense. Stone-weathered iron-rusted carvings became obscured by moss and lichen. Families were responsible for the upkeep of their plots and memorials, leading to varying states of repair across the cemetery. Some monuments remain pristine today, a testament to continued family care or historical preservation efforts, while others are crumbling their inscriptions, faded their angels headless, silent witnesses to forgotten lineages and the slow, inevitable decay of time. The sheer variety of design and symbolism also created a unique visual aesthetic that we now associate strongly with the Victorian era. The blend of classical Gothic Egyptian and sometimes even Moorish influences, combined with the specific Victorian interpretations of religious and allegorical symbols, produced a distinct cemetery landscape unlike any other historical period. It was a maximalist approach to memorialization, a desire to pack as much meaning, status, and visual impact as possible into each stone structure. It's as if they were saying, if we have to die, we might as well make it look interesting. Even the epitaphs, the inscriptions on the stones, became more elaborate and personal during this period. While older markers might simply list a name, and dates Victorian epitaphs often included biblical verses, poetic lines, or heartfelt and sometimes lengthy tributes to the deceased's virtues, piety, or suffering. These short pieces of text provided another layer of personalization and emotional expression, offering a glimpse into the individual lives and the grief of those who commissioned the stone. Some are profoundly moving, others are surprisingly blunt, and a few are unintentionally hilarious by modern standards, though you'd have to be careful not to laugh too loudly. Think about the skill involved. Imagine a stonemason spending weeks or months carving delicate flowers or a weeping figure out of a solid block of marble. It required not just technical skill, but artistic sensibility. These were often family trades passed down through generations, contributing to the distinct character of monuments in different regions. The craftsmanship on some of the better examples is truly stunning, turning cold stone into flowing fabric or soft flesh, trying to capture the fleeting emotions of grief in something meant to last forever. In conclusion, these Victorian grave monuments were far more than just markers of burial sites. They were complex cultural artifacts, simultaneously serving as expressions of personal grief, declarations of social status, public art displays, and historical records. They shaped the visual landscape of the cemeteries, created an industry of craftsmen, and provided a tangible focus for the ongoing rituals of remembrance. They stand today as a silent, stony exhibition of Victorian values, anxieties, and the enduring human desire to be remembered, to leave a mark, to have your life and death inscribed permanently upon the earth. They are the lasting architectural legacy of a time when the need for more space for the dead led to the creation of these elaborate outdoor museums of mortality and social hierarchy. And while the living who walked among them have long since joined the permanent residents, the stones they erected continue their silent vigil, telling their stories to anyone who cares to look and listen. So you've wandered amongst the grand statements of stone, the weeping angels and proud obelisks, the tiny temples and the humble crosses, all declaring presence and permanence in this city of the dead. But stone, as solid as it seems, is not immune to the relentless passage of time. These monuments, erected with such care and expense, immediately began a slow, quiet conversation with the elements. The story doesn't end with the dedication of the stone. It continues a slow decay punctuated by moments of human intervention or neglect. See that elaborate carving there? The one where the angel's nose looks a little worn down. That's not just age. That's rain, wind, frost, sunlight pollution, a constant slow-motion battle between durable rock and the patient forces of nature. Victorian London, remember, was getting pretty sooty. The air was thick with coal smoke from factories and homes. That soot settled on everything, including the nice clean marble clinging to the carvings, getting washed into pores by the rain, and gradually turning surfaces gray or even black. Acid rain, a byproduct of all that industrial activity, would subtly eat away at the more delicate stones like marble and sandstone, softening the edges, blurring the inscriptions, and making those finely carved details, like Aunt Mildred's favorite lace collar, rendered in stone a little less distinct each year. Families, when they purchased a plot, were generally responsible for its upkeep. The cemetery company provided the space, the paths, the fences, maybe a gatehouse, and some general groundskeeping. But your little patch of immortality, that was on you. Think of it like buying a tiny park. You gotta mow the lawn, trim the bushes, clean the statue, make sure nobody scribbles on it. For families with means and a continued presence in the area, this wasn't so much of a problem. They'd visit perhaps regularly, tending the little garden plots that were often part of a gravesite, planting flowers, trimming hedges, pulling weeds that dared to sprout near dear departed Uncle Reginald's pointy rock. They might even hire the cemetery staff or independent masons to clean the stone or make minor repairs. But life happens, doesn't it? Families moved away, descendants died without heirs, relationships fractured, or simply the memory faded over generations. Who cleans grandma's stone when the grandkids have moved to Australia and the great-grandkids have never even heard of this cemetery? Slowly, inevitably, neglect set in for many plots. The carefully tended flowers would wither and die, replaced by tenacious weeds and self-seeded saplings. Moss and lichen, those green and gray pioneers, would colonize the stone surfaces, softening inscriptions and turning bright white marble into something ancient and mottled. Tree roots, relentless in their search for water and nutrients, would insinuate themselves under foundations, tilting headstones, cracking pedestals, and sometimes even lifting entire slabs off the ground. Walking through a Victorian cemetery today, the contrast is often stark. Here's a monument gleaming white, its carvings sharp, maybe surrounded by fresh flowers, clearly visited and cared for. And right next to it, a stone tilted at a drunken angle, half swallowed by ivy, its inscription illegible beneath a blanket of green, looking like it hasn't been touched by human hands in a century. It's a visual representation of fading memory of lineages that have ended or moved on. It's a bit melancholy, isn't it? Like a silent party where half the guests have left and nobody's cleaned up the plates. Mainstream historical fact. The responsibility for maintaining individual burial plots and their monuments typically rested with the purchasing families rather than the cemetery companies, leading to a significant disparity in the condition of grave sites and contributing to the gradual decay of many memorials over time as families' ability or willingness to provide care diminished. Beyond the slow decay of nature and neglect, there was also the more abrupt human element of damage, vandalism, and theft. These were open spaces accessible, sometimes poorly lit at night, and filled with valuable materials. Statues, especially smaller or more accessible ones, could be damaged. Heads broken off, arms snapped, delicate features chipped away. Metal railings around plots, often made of iron or sometimes more valuable bronze, were tempting targets for scrap metal thieves, particularly in leaner times. You'd see plots with ragged gaps where decorative fences once stood, leaving the space looking vulnerable and unfinished. Even the stones themselves weren't safe. Inscriptions might be defaced or surfaces scratched. Though perhaps less common in the Victorian era than today, graffiti wasn't entirely unknown. And sometimes damage was less malicious and more accidental. A groundskeeper's mower hitting a stone, a tree branch falling during a storm. It all added up to a landscape that was constantly under threat of degradation. Imagine you've saved up for years to buy the grandest marble angel for your dearly departed wife, only for some ruffian to chip its nose off looking for pigeon nests. Infuriating, right? Though I suppose she wouldn't know. The cemetery companies, while not responsible for plot maintenance, were responsible for the overall grounds. They employed staff, groundskeepers to cut the grass initially with scythes later, with early forms of mowers, gardeners to tend the shared landscaping, and often a resident keeper or superintendent who lived on site overseeing operations, managing burials, and providing security. These keepers could be formidable figures patrolling the paths and keeping an eye out for troublemakers. Both human and animal stray livestock wandering in was an occasional problem in the earlier, more rural locations. They also dealt with the practicalities of digging graves, often a physically demanding and sometimes grim task, especially before mechanical diggers. The idea of perpetual care, as we might understand it today, Paying a lump sum to the cemetery for ongoing maintenance forever was sometimes offered, but it wasn't the norm and certainly wasn't always reliable. These early endowments were often insufficient, or the money wasn't managed well over the very long term. So many families simply paid for the plot and the initial monument installation, assuming future generations would pick up the torch. When they didn't, the stones slowly began their journey back to the earth. It was a bit of a gamble, really, betting on the long-term dedication of your great-great-grandchildren, whom you'd never even meet. Risky, but I guess planning for that far ahead is hard when you're busy choosing between a broken column and an urn. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to maintenance involves the practice of body snatching, which, while primarily associated with earlier periods, didn't entirely vanish with the new cemeteries. Although less common due to better security and deeper graves, the fear persisted. One less macabre but still unusual form of scavenging involved people taking plants or even small decorative items from graves. Sometimes it was simply admiration for a particularly lovely rose bush on a plot, or perhaps a belief that items from a grave held some kind of mystical property. There are accounts, though difficult to verify definitively, of people taking soil stones, or even flowers for various folk remedies or superstitious practices, treating the cemetery not just as a place of mourning, but a strange kind of natural resource, albeit a morbid one. Imagine needing a specific type of moss for a cure and thinking, right time for a trip to the local graveyard. Historians still argue whether the varying states of plot maintenance and the eventual decay seen in many Victorian cemeteries reflect a decline in respect for the dead, a shift in mourning practices, or simply the inevitable consequence of economic realities in changing family structures. Was it that people cared less about their ancestors over time? Or that the complex web of industrialization, urbanization, and social mobility made the kind of multi-generational localized care of plots less feasible? It's hard to say whether it's fading sentiment or just the practical difficulty of getting across town or across the country to mow a deceased relative's small patch of grass every few weeks. The financial aspect of maintenance was also significant. Cleaning a large marble monument wasn't cheap. Repairing a broken sculpture required skilled labor. Even basic weeding and grass cutting cost money, whether paid to the cemetery staff or an independent gardener. For families who were just getting by or whose fortunes declined, these expenses quickly became a burden and easily deferred task in favor of feeding the living. So the state of a grave could often be a direct, albeit delayed, indicator of the family's economic trajectory over the decades following the burial. A well-maintained plot suggested continued prosperity and connection. A neglected one, a different story entirely. Think about the poor groundskeepers trudging through acres and acres of land scythe in hand initially. It was back-breaking work, keeping the paths clear, the shared lawns tidy, dealing with fallen leaves in autumn, and all this while trying not to disturb a funeral or accidentally dig up a fresh grave while working on another plot. Their job was essential to the functioning and appearance of the cemetery, but it was often low-paid and physically demanding. They were the unsung heroes, or perhaps just the unsung labor responsible for making these grand spaces function day to day. You probably wouldn't envy their job description. Duties include mowing, weeding, digging holes in the ground for dead people. Must be okay with silence and occasional existential dread. The natural world wasn't just an agent of decay, it also began to reclaim the spaces. Trees planted for shade and beauty grew large, their roots spreading far and wide. Ivy initially planted decoratively on walls, or around some plots proved to be incredibly vigorous, climbing over monuments, swallowing smaller stones, entirely turning structures into green lumps. While some people found this natural reclamation beautiful, a symbol of nature's power, and the eventual return to the earth, others saw it as disrespectful, hiding the monuments and making access difficult. It was a constant negotiation between the planned, manicured landscape and the wild, untamed forces of growth and decay. The visual consequences of this varied maintenance and decay are what give many older Victorian cemeteries their distinctive character today. They aren't uniform fields of stones. They are dynamic landscapes showing the passage of time, the shifting fortunes of families, and the power of nature. You see the perfect, the neglected, the broken, the overgrown. A chaotic, beautiful, and sometimes melancholic mix that tells a story beyond just the names and dates on the stones. It's history, written not just in grand monuments, but in peeling paint on an iron railing, a crack running through a granite obelisk, or a carving softened to an almost abstract shape by centuries of rain. Consider the emotional impact of visiting a family plot that has fallen into disrepair. For later generations, discovering such a grave could be a powerful and perhaps sad experience. Seeing the physical decay mirrors the fading connection to that ancestor. It might spur them to attempt restoration, connecting with a distant past. Or it might simply serve as a quiet reminder of mortality and the transient nature of human endeavors, even the grandest monuments meant to defy time. That proud monument meant to last forever now stands as a poignant symbol of the opposite, of lost forgetting and inevitable physical decline. It's a heavy thought to carry around, especially when you're just trying to find Uncle Bartholomew's slightly too enthusiastic marble cherub. So while the Victorians built these cities for the dead, with grand visions of permanence and lasting remembrance, the reality on the ground was a constant battle against decay, neglect, and the occasional opportunist with a crowbar. The cemeteries became living, changing landscapes, not static museums of mortality. The grand monuments stood tall, but their surfaces were constantly being worked upon by soot-rain moss and the slow, persistent erosion of time and human memory. It's a reminder that even the most solid expressions of grief and status are ultimately fleeting, subject to the same forces that affect everything else in the world. The stone may last longer than the flesh, but it doesn't last forever, and sometimes, frankly, neither does the effort to keep it looking spiffy. So you've seen how the grand vision of eternal rest in a permanent, sprawling necropolis was already running into trouble. The space was finite, the decay was relentless, and the cost and effort of maintaining these stone cities were proving too much for many families over time. The Victorians, practical as they could be when not draped in several pounds of black crepe, started to think, isn't there a better way? A more efficient way? A way that doesn't involve your great-great-grandkids trying to figure out who Grandma Mildred was based on a moss-covered rock. This pressure cooker of limited space public health concerns, remember those ghastly smells from overflowing churchyards and the sheer permanence of physical decay, began pushing people toward a radical idea. Something that had been practiced in ancient times across different cultures, but was largely abandoned in Christian Europe for centuries: cremation. Burning the body, turning flesh and bone back into ash quickly and cleanly. Now hold on a second, you might think. This sounds intense, and you'd be right. For a society deeply rooted in Christian tradition, where burial in the earth was seen as the proper, perhaps even necessary prelude to resurrection, the idea of deliberately destroying the body with fire was deeply confronting, even sacrilegious to many. It felt unnatural, cold, perhaps even barbaric compared to the solemn lowering of a coffin into the earth. It flew in the face of centuries of ritual and belief. Imagine suggesting this to your devout Victorian grandmother. You'd probably get slapped, then prayed over. But the arguments for it were compelling, especially to a forward-thinking, scientifically minded few. Public health advocates horrified by the thought of millions of bodies slowly decomposing in urban areas, leaching fluids into the soil, and potentially contaminating water supplies saw cremation as a hygienic imperative. Sir Henry Thompson, a prominent surgeon and physician, was a particularly vocal proponent. He saw cremation not just as a sanitary measure, but as a dignified and scientific way to dispose of remains far preferable to the slow indignity of decay. He, along with others, founded the Cremation Society of Great Britain in 1874. Their goal to promote the practice and, crucially, to make it legal. Because at this point, cremation wasn't technically illegal, but it wasn't quite legal either. It existed in a sort of gray area. If you did it discreetly, perhaps on private land, it might pass without comment, especially if there were no suspicious circumstances around the death. But doing it openly as a public service was another matter. There were legal challenges, fears that it could destroy evidence of foul play, hard to prove poisoning if the body is ash, right, and deep-seated public suspicion. The pushback was significant. Religious leaders condemned it, newspapers debated it fiercely, and the public imagination, fueled by sensationalist reporting, often conjured images of smoky industrial furnaces rather than a clean, respectful process. It seemed alien, impersonal. Think about it from a sentimental point of view. For centuries, mourning involved visiting a specific spot in the earth, placing flowers, perhaps having a small picnic. Yes, that was a thing weirdly. It was tangible. With cremation, what did you have? A box of ashes? Where did you put the flowers? It felt less real somehow, less connected to the person who had been. The Victorians were big on ritual and tangible symbols of grief. A little urn of gray powder felt rather inadequate to some compared to a giant marble angel weeping over a granite slab. Despite the opposition, the need persisted. The cemeteries were filling up, especially in London and other major cities. Even with the creation of the Magnificent Seven and others, the rate of urban growth and population increase meant they were still struggling to keep pace. Land was expensive, and continually expanding outwards wasn't a sustainable long-term solution. Cremation offered a way to handle multiple burials, or rather, dispositions in the same space, with ashes taking up dramatically less room than a full coffin and body. It was the ultimate space saver. You could even scatter the ashes requiring no physical plot at all, though this was even more radical for the time. The Cremation Society, driven by people like Thompson, decided they had to force the issue. They established the first crematorium in Woking, Surrey in 1878. It was a modest building designed to look more like a chapel than a factory, but they couldn't actually use it officially at first. The legal uncertainty was too great. They conducted a few experimental cremations, primarily of animals, to test the process and demonstrate its cleanliness. It wasn't until 1884, following a high-profile court case, the R.V. Price case, where a Welshman, William Price, who had cremated his infant son in a public ceremony using paraffin and brushwood, was controversially acquitted because the judge couldn't find a specific law against it, that the legal fog began to lift. The judge ruled that while cremation wasn't traditional burial, it wasn't necessarily unlawful as long as it wasn't a public nuisance and didn't hinder an inquest. This ruling surprisingly perhaps gave the Cremation Society the green light they needed. Mainstream historical fact. The first officially sanctioned human cremation in the United Kingdom took place at the Woking Crematorium in 1885, marking a pivotal moment in the slow acceptance of cremation as a legitimate alternative to traditional burial. The first person to be officially cremated at Woking was a woman named Jeanette Pickersgill. She was a well-known figure in artistic and literary circles, and importantly, she had specifically requested cremation in her will. This was a crucial aspect. It wasn't just about making it possible, but about making it accepted. Having prominent individuals choose cremation helped chip away at the social stigma. Still, the numbers were tiny initially. In 1886, there were only 10 cremations in the UK. By 1900, it was still only 443 for the entire country. Compare that to hundreds of thousands of burials each year. It was a fringe practice chosen by a small, often scientifically or secularly minded minority. Beyond cremation, were there other innovations addressing the space crisis? Not really in the same radical way. Some discussions revolved around standardizing coffin sizes or using less durable materials that would decompose faster, though this ran counter to the desire for lasting monuments. There was talk of stacked burials in some continental cemeteries or vaults holding multiple coffins, but these were often expensive and didn't solve the overall land crunch in the long run. Reusing graves after a certain period of practice in some older churchyards, where records were poor or non-existent, was generally frowned upon in the grand commercial cemeteries, which promised perpetual tenure even if the maintenance wasn't perpetually funded. So cremation was really the big revolutionary solution on the table for addressing the space problem head-on. It changed the fundamental assumption that the final disposition must involve occupying a significant patch of Earth for eternity. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to early cremation efforts involves the initial attempts to design the crematorium furnace itself. Given that this was a new technology for human remains, there was a lot of experimentation. Early designs sometimes struggled with ensuring complete combustion, controlling smoke and odor, and making the process look, well, dignified. Stories circulated, likely exaggerated by opponents, about difficulties, unpleasant smells, or the resulting ashes not being quite what people expected. It wasn't simply a matter of putting the body in a fire. It required carefully controlled temperature and airflow to reduce the body effectively to bone fragments, which are then processed into the fine ash we think of today. It was an industrial process being applied to a deeply personal and symbolic act, And figuring out the technical, and presentational aspects was a learning curve. Imagine being the engineer tasked with designing the first ever Victorian human incinerator. Right needs to be hot, smokeless, and not terrifying. Good luck. The acceptance of cremation was a slow burn, if you'll pardon the terrible pun. It took decades for it to move from being a weird, slightly suspicious act for eccentrics and rationalists to becoming a mainstream choice. The legal framework gradually solidified with acts like the Cremation Act of 1902, which established rules and regulations requiring medical certificates to prevent the destruction of evidence. This helped address the concerns about hiding crime. More crematoria were built in other cities, often run by municipal authorities rather than private companies. The cost gradually decreased relative to burial, making it a more accessible option. Historians still argue whether the eventual rise of cremation was primarily a victory for public health science over tradition, a practical response to urban overcrowding, and land cost a reflection of changing religious or secular attitudes towards death in the body, or simply a matter of growing consumer choice as costs lowered. Was it driven by the rational arguments of people like Thompson, or did it only take off when it became convenient and affordable for the average person? It's likely a combination of factors, a complex interplay between societal needs, technological development, legal shifts, and evolving beliefs about what constitutes a proper end. Interestingly, the rise of cremation also had implications for the monument business. If you chose cremation and decided to scatter the ashes, there was no longer a need for a headstone or grave marker. If you interred the ashes in a crematorium's garden of remembrance, you might have a small plaque, but nothing like the elaborate monuments of the burial grounds. This was potentially bad news for the mason sculptors and cemetery plot sellers. They were invested quite literally in the earth-based method of disposition. So there was also an economic resistance to overcome, though perhaps less overt than the religious or sentimental objections. For those who did choose cremation and inter the ashes, new forms of memorialization emerged. Gardens of remembrance with small plaques, walls with niches for urns, or even scattering plots where families could visit. These spaces were often simpler, more naturalistic, and took up vastly less room than traditional graves. It was a visual manifestation of the changing landscape of death itself, from sprawling cities of stone to serene gardens holding the concentrated essence of remains. The transition wasn't linear or simple. For many years, burial remained the default, the tradition, the expected way to go. Cremation was the alternative, the slightly peculiar option. But the seeds were sown in the Victorian era, driven by the undeniable pressures of an industrializing, urbanizing world, running out of physical space to put its dead. The grand cemeteries, conceived as eternal resting places, had highlighted the problem. Cremation offered a fundamentally different, albeit controversial answer. It was in a way the ultimate form of decomposition accelerated and contained solving the problem of decay and space by embracing transformation rather than resisting it. So while the cemeteries you were wandering through were still the dominant method of disposition, well into the 20th century, the option to quite literally go up in smoke was becoming increasingly available, slowly eroding the monopoly of the gravediggers and the monument makers. It was a quiet revolution initiated by a few determined individuals who looked at the overflowing graveyards and thought, yeah, this isn't sustainable. Time for a bit of fire. And frankly, given the state of some of those neglected plots we talked about earlier, maybe fire wasn't such a bad idea after all. At least the ashes don't get taken over by ivy. Unless you sprinkle them on ivy, I suppose. Don't do that. The pressure was building layer upon layer, just like those unfortunate souls in the overflowing pits. Something had to change, and eventually, spurred by the reformers, official attempts began. But like trying to turn a sluggish, overloaded ship in a narrow channel, these initial efforts were often piecemeal, reluctant, and frankly, not very effective. You can imagine the scene committees meeting, debating, issuing decrees that sounded good on paper, but crumbled in the face of logistical reality and ingrained resistance. One of the simplest attempts was to restrict burial numbers or enforce regulations about burial depth, which often weren't followed because there simply wasn't enough space to dig deep enough, or the profit motive for squeezing in one more coffin was just too strong. Orders might come down from on high. Thou shalt not bury more than X people per week in this churchyard. But when the sexton had a queue of grieving families and a shovel ready, those orders were often ignored. Or perhaps they'd issue temporary closure orders for the absolute worst sites. But where were people supposed to bury their dead then? The other overcrowded churchyards, of course, just shifting the problem slightly down the street. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. Another solution was, as we touched on earlier, just adding more soil on top. Raising the level of the graveyard became a common, if utterly horrifying, practice. More earth was dumped onto the existing burials, creating layers of dead people separated by thin layers of soil. This raised the ground level, sometimes significantly, putting the churchyard literally higher than the surrounding streets. Imagine your neighborhood park slowly turning into a series of gently rising mounds because they keep burying people on top of people. Not exactly picturesque, is it? And while it created some temporary space, it certainly didn't solve the issues of decomposition gases, groundwater pollution, or the general unpleasantness. It was less a solution and more like sweeping an entire decomposing body under a very thin rug. Then came the slightly more radical idea born out of sheer necessity and championed by those who saw the crisis clearly move burials out of the city. The concept was to establish large new cemeteries on the outskirts of London, far away from the densely populated areas. This wasn't just about space, it was also about public health. Get the decaying organic matter away from where people lived, breathed, and drew water. It seemed logical, almost ridiculously simple in hindsight, but implementing it faced enormous hurdles. First, there was the practical challenge of acquiring land. Building large cemeteries required significant plots, and land around London was becoming increasingly valuable as the city expanded. Who would buy it? Who would manage it? It wasn't a traditional parish function. This required private enterprise or significant public investment, neither of which was easily forthcoming. Second, there was the logistical nightmare of transportation. How would you get a body often accompanied by a grieving family from the crowded city center out to a cemetery miles away? Carriages were expensive, and carrying a coffin through busy streets wasn't easy. The poor especially would find this incredibly difficult. The traditional walk from the deceased's home to the local churchyard funeral service and then burial was a community ritual. Moving it miles away disrupted this entirely. It was like being told you suddenly have to drive 2 hours to your local post office. Third, and perhaps most significant, was the emotional and spiritual resistance. For centuries, people had been buried in the consecrated ground of their parish churchyard, often alongside generations of their family. This was sacred space intimately connected to their identity and faith. The idea of burying loved ones miles away in some new, unfamiliar, potentially non-parochial ground felt wrong, cold, and disconnected. People worried about their ancestors' remains being left alone far from the community they belonged to. The attachment to the local churchyard was incredibly strong. It wasn't just dirt and stones, it was memory, heritage, and faith physically manifested. Telling someone their loved one couldn't be buried near their grandmother because London ran out of space was not a conversation that went well. The private sector saw an opportunity here. If public or parish efforts were failing, maybe businesses could step in. Entrepreneurs began to propose the creation of these large commercial cemeteries outside the city. They would acquire the land landscape it often quite beautifully to make it appealing, build chapels, and offer burial plots for a fee. These weren't churchyards. They were businesses providing a service. This was a radical shift in the concept of burial space. But even these private initiatives faced resistance. The existing church authorities saw them as a direct threat to their income from burial fees. Why would people pay a private company when they could use the traditional, albeit packed churchyard clergy, and sextons lobbied fiercely against these new ventures, sometimes portraying them as irreligious or exploitative? It was a clash between tradition, public need, and capitalist enterprise, all played out over the final resting places of the departed. Mainstream historical fact time. The first of these large, privately owned cemeteries to open near London was Kensal Green Cemetery in 1832. It was established by the General Cemetery Company and modeled on Père Lachaise in Paris, aiming to be not just a burial ground, but also a park-like space for the living to visit and remember. Now, for a quirky tidbit, before the big cemeteries opened, there were also smaller temporary or makeshift burial sites established during particularly bad periods like cholera, outbreaks, just to cope with the sheer volume of dead. These were often grim, hastily consecrated plots that added to the chaotic landscape rather than solving the long-term problem. Imagine a pop-up graveyard appearing at the end of your street because things were just that bad. Despite the opposition and difficulties, the need was undeniable, and the private cemetery movement slowly gained traction. These companies started acquiring land and planning their grand, spacious grounds. They offered a promise of dignity, order, and permanence that the overflowing, chaotic city churchyards could no longer provide. They began to market themselves not just as places for burial, but as tranquil, beautiful destinations, a far cry from the noisome pits people were used to. Historians still argue whether the rise of the private cemetery movement was driven more by genuine philanthropic desire to solve a public health crisis and provide decent burial space, or by the simple capitalist motive of exploiting a desperate market need for profit. Was it civic duty or supply and demand? Like a perfectly stacked Jenga tower of conflicting motives, it was probably a bit of both, each layer contributing to the eventual collapse of the old system and the rise of the new. These new cemeteries, the ones that would eventually become famous as the Magnificent Seven, represented the beginning of the end for the packed to bursting city churchyards. But their establishment and widespread acceptance wasn't immediate or easy. There were still legal battles, protests, and cultural shifts required before the majority of London's dead found their way to these new suburban resting places. The journey from crisis to solution was still very much underway, marked by tentative steps forward and significant pushback from those clinging to the old ways or just trying to keep their heads and their income above the rising tide of earth and, well, you know. So while the official channels dithered issuing toothless regulations and occasionally burying bodies on top of the already buried bodies, the private sector, driven by a combination of genuine public health concern and, let's be honest, a keen eye for profit, began to pick up the slack. You see this pattern throughout history, don't you? Government moves slowly like a sleepy sloth on sedatives, and then some enterprising folks say, hey, there's a problem here and maybe also some money. The idea of purpose-built large-scale cemeteries outside the bustling city wasn't entirely new globally. Paris had Père Lachaise established earlier. But implementing it in London faced those unique layers of resistance we talked about. Yet the sheer unavoidable reality of the overflowing churchyards created an undeniable pressure cooker. The stench, the visible horror, the very real fear of disease. It all reached a point where inertia simply couldn't hold out any longer. This era marks the rise of what are now collectively known as the Magnificent Seven. Doesn't that sound like a cool action movie? Less six-shooters, more shovels, though. These were 7 large privately owned cemeteries established in the ring around London between 1832 and 1841. Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton, and Tower Hamlets. They weren't churchyards in the traditional sense. They were commercial ventures designed and managed by private companies operating under specific acts of parliament. And they were a game changer. Imagine the contrast. You've just experienced burying a loved one in a crowded, damp churchyard where the ground is uneven from shifting graves, the air smells. Well, you know how it smells, and you half expect to see a tibia sticking out of the ground. Then someone tells you about a new place. This place is miles away, yes, but it's vast. Acres upon acres of land. It's professionally landscaped with rolling hills, winding paths, mature trees, beautiful chapels, and carefully laid out plots. It's quiet, peaceful, almost serene. You could walk there without tripping over gravestones or holding your nose. This wasn't just a burial ground. It was designed to be a destination. Inspired by European models, these cemeteries were envisioned as Victorian parklands, places where the living could come visit their deceased relatives and also simply enjoy a stroll in a beautiful contemplative environment. Think of it as the original destination funeral. Except the destination was also a lovely spot for a Sunday picnic, though maybe don't eat right next to the fresh grave. That's still a bit weird. People, especially families, would genuinely spend afternoons in these cemeteries, walking amongst the monuments, admiring the landscaping, and yes, escaping the grime and noise of the city. The business model was relatively straightforward. The companies purchased large tracts of land, designed the layout, built the necessary infrastructure, chapels, lodges, boundary walls, and then sold burial plots. Plots varied in size and location with different fees depending on whether you wanted a private mausoleum spot a family plot, or a single grave. They also often offered perpetual care options. Pay a bit extra, and the company promises to look after the grave and surrounding area forever. A promise that, like many forever promises, sometimes got a little shaky over the centuries, but that's another story. This shift required a change in public perception and legislation. The cemetery companies had to lobby Parliament to get the necessary acts passed, granting them the authority to operate and crucially consecrate the ground. This was a significant hurdle as it challenged the established authority of the Church of England over burials. But the crisis was so undeniable that eventually the political will emerged. Kensal Green, as we mentioned, led the way, opening its gates in 1832. It was a huge success, demonstrating that there was a massive demand for decent, orderly burial space, and people were willing to pay for it. Following its lead came West Norwood, 1837, Highgate, 1839, Nunhead, 1840, Brompton, 1840, Tower Hamlets, 1841, and Abney Park, 1840. Each had its own character, often reflecting the demographics of the area it served or the specific vision of its founders. Highgate, for instance, became known for its dramatic landscaping, winding paths up steep hills, and eventually its elaborate Victorian mausoleums and architecture attracting the wealthy and prominent. It has a certain Gothic romance to it, the kind of place where you expect a brooding figure in a cape to suddenly appear from behind a tombstone. West Norwood was also grand, with impressive catacombs. Abney Park in Stoke Newington was designed as an arboretum as well as a cemetery focusing on nonconformist burials and intending to be an educational space about nature. Brompton had a central avenue leading to a grand dome, almost like a secular cathedral of the dead. One mainstream historical fact about these cemeteries: they were designed by leading architects and landscape gardeners of the time, incorporating architectural styles from Egyptian to Gothic revival for their chapels, lodges, and monuments. This wasn't just digging holes in a field, it was planned, deliberate, and often beautiful design. The impact on public health was enormous. By diverting burials away from the dense urban core and its saturated groundwater, they significantly reduced the risk of water contamination and the spread of disease linked to decomposition. The foul miasma, once a constant oppressive presence in many neighborhoods, began to recede as the primary sites of decay were moved miles away. It was like finally taking the overflowing, smelly garbage can out of your tiny living room and putting it way out on the street. A simple but profoundly effective change. Of course, it wasn't universally accessible. These were private businesses, and burying someone in a Magnificent Seven cemetery cost money. While they offered different price points, it was generally more expensive than a pauper's burial in a parish yard. This meant that the poorest continued to face challenges, and many still ended up in overcrowded public cemeteries or workhouse burial grounds for a while longer. The problem wasn't completely solved for everyone, but for a significant portion of the population, it offered a dignified alternative. Think about the logistics for a moment. If your loved one died in, say, the East End, and you wanted them buried in Brompton or Kensal Green on the other side of town, you had to arrange transportation. This often involved elaborate horse-drawn hearses, sometimes accompanied by long funeral processions that would wind their way through the city streets. These processions became a familiar, if somber, sight, a physical manifestation of the changing geography of death. You can almost hear the clip-clop of the horses and the slow turning of the wheels as the carriage carrying the departed, perhaps draped in black velvet, made its solemn journey across London. It was a final public parade before reaching the quiet green expanse of the new necropolis. The quirky tidbit here: the Superintendent's Lodge at Brompton Cemetery, designed by architect Benjamin Baud, includes a flat roof that was apparently designed so Baud could live there and keep an eye on construction progress. Imagine living at the entrance to a massive new cemetery just to make sure the builders weren't slacking off. Dedication, or maybe just a slightly morbid preference for neighbors. Historians still argue whether the success of the Magnificent Seven was primarily due to their superior design and management, or simply the desperate, overwhelming lack of alternatives after decades of inaction. Was it innovation that pulled people in? Or was it the horror of the old system pushing them away? Like trying to decide if you ate that questionable leftover curry because it looked appealing, or because everything else in the fridge had developed sentience and started writing passive-aggressive notes. Probably a bit of both. These cemeteries also played a significant role in changing funerary practices. They encouraged the use of more substantial permanent monuments. Not just simple headstones, but elaborate crosses, obelisks, angels, and even miniature temple-like structures. This wasn't just about memorializing the dead. It was also a way for the living to display their wealth and social status. The cemeteries became open-air museums of Victorian art architecture and social history, the landscape dotted with stone testaments to earthly success. And for the poor souls who had been buried layer upon layer in the city pits, their fate was varied. Some remains were eventually disinterred and moved to the new cemeteries, a complex and often controversial process, while others remained in the now closed churchyards, which were sometimes capped with concrete or turned into public gardens, their history buried beneath layers of earth and landscaping. The establishment of the Magnificent Seven didn't instantly solve the problem of urban burial entirely. Smaller parish cemeteries outside the core continued to operate, and public pressure for reform led to further legislation later on. But they represented the decisive turning point. They demonstrated a viable, scalable, and dignified alternative to the crisis-ridden status quo. They shifted the physical location of death and mourning and helped to create a new cultural understanding of what a cemetery could be. Not just a crowded, unsanitary pit, but a place of beauty, remembrance, and even leisure. The era of the overflowing churchyard was thankfully drawing to a close, pushed aside by these grand green cities of the dead. So while the Magnificent Seven were doing their sterling work, proving that large-scale out-of-town burial was viable and even desirable, the core problem of the overflowing churchyards within the city walls still loomed large. The stench might have lessened a bit in certain areas, but the ground itself remained saturated, unstable, and frankly horrifyingly full. Remember those stories of digging up old bones just to make room? That was still happening, just perhaps slightly less frequently, in areas served by the new private cemeteries. But not everyone could afford or wanted to use the private grounds. The sheer ecological disaster needed a more heavy-handed legislative solution. The government, having finally stirred from its collective nap after decades of petitions, reports, and nose-holding exercises, eventually decided that something official had to be done. You see, even with the private sector stepping up, there was no legal power to force the closure of the most offensive, overcrowded parish burial grounds. It was all a bit like trying to get your teenager to clean their room by politely suggesting they might enjoy a tidier space. Not super effective without the threat of taking away their phone. The first major attempt at tackling this legislatively was the Metropolitan Interments Act of 1850. Now, this was an ambitious beast. It proposed creating a central body, the Metropolitan Interments Board, which would effectively take control of all burials in London. It aimed to purchase and close existing private and parish grounds in the city and establish large public cemeteries further out, funded by burial fees. The idea was to create a unified public system for burial across London. Sounds logical, right? Well, this is Victorian Britain we're talking about, and logic often took a back seat to vested interests and complex layers of authority. The act ran into a wall of opposition almost immediately. Parish vestries, who made money from burials, hated the idea of losing control. Private cemetery companies who were just getting into their stride and didn't want to be bought out or face public competition lobbied furiously against it. Landowners whose property might be compulsorily purchased weren't exactly thrilled either, and the practicalities of setting up such a vast, centralized system proved incredibly difficult. It was a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in red tape tied up with bows, made of angry letters from solicitors. Think of it like trying to get several hundred independent corner shops, a dozen large supermarkets, and every lemonade stand in the country to all sell their goods under one single state-run umbrella company with a board that argued about the price of milk for hours. It was never going to run smoothly. The Metropolitan Interments Act of 1850 was, in short, a spectacular failure. It was largely impractical, politically fraught, and ultimately repealed just a couple of years later. It managed to close a few grounds, mostly smaller, particularly offensive ones, but it didn't solve the systemic problem across the board. It was like putting a small decorative band-aid on a gaping wound that required major surgery. However, the failure of the 1850 Act didn't mean the government gave up entirely, though you could forgive people for thinking they might. The pressure from sanitary reformers like Edwin Chadwick public health officials and a genuinely disgusted public continued to mount. The problem wasn't disappearing. If anything, it was getting worse in the remaining open churchyards. This led to the passage of the Burial Act of 1852. This act and subsequent ones in 1853 and later were far more effective because they were simpler and less ambitious in terms of central control. Instead of trying to nationalize burial, these acts empowered the Privy Council to close burial grounds by order in council if they were deemed overcrowded or dangerous to public health. Crucially, they also enabled parishes or groups of parishes to form burial boards and establish their own new public cemeteries outside the city boundaries funded by local rates or loans. This was the real turning point. It gave local authorities the legal power to shut down the old dangerous sites and provided a mechanism for creating new public ones, ensuring that decent burial space wasn't only the preserve of those who could afford the private cemetery fees. It created a dual system, the private Magnificent Seven and their successors, alongside the new publicly managed municipal cemeteries. So imagine you are living near a churchyard that has been in use for centuries. It's literally overflowing. The ground level is higher than the church floor, and you can smell it on a hot day. One day a notice goes up on the church door. By order of the Privy Council, this burial ground is closed to new interments from a certain date, often within weeks or months. No more digging new graves here ever. What happened to the old sites? Well, that varied. Some were simply locked up their gates, secured, becoming frozen-in-time capsules of Victorian urban death. Others were partially cleared and converted into public gardens or playgrounds, often with headstones pushed to the edges or laid flat to create paved areas. Imagine your kids playing football on a patch of grass that you know is just inches above layers and layers of long-buried remains. It adds a certain historical depth to a kickabout, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to these closures. In some instances, when old churchyards were converted into public spaces, locals reported strange occurrences or feelings of unease. Whether this was psychological based on knowing what lay beneath or something else is of course up for debate. But the idea of parks built on centuries of graves has always held a certain spooky fascination. Some reports even detail sightings of mournful figures or inexplicable chills in these urban green spaces, a testament to the layers of history buried just below the surface. The closure orders didn't always go smoothly. There were sometimes protests from families who had traditional burial rights in those grounds, or from church officials reluctant to give up their authority. But the legal power was there, backed by the undeniable public health imperative. The era of inner-city burial was definitively coming to an end. One mainstream historical fact derived from this, the Burial Acts of the 1850s, were pivotal public health legislation directly addressing the sanitary crisis caused by urban churchyards and laying the foundation for the cemetery system that still largely operates in the UK today. They are as important in the history of public health as sewer systems or clean water provision, albeit less glamorous. Nobody writes ballads about the thrilling passage of the 1852 Burial Act. The shift wasn't just about where people were buried, but also how. With more space available in the new cemeteries, the practice of digging multiple layers of bodies in a single plot began to decline significantly. Graves were typically dug deeper with more space allocated per individual or family plot. This wasn't just about dignity for the deceased. It was also about slowing decomposition and reducing the immediate health risks associated with shallow burials. The new municipal cemeteries empowered by the Burial Acts started opening throughout the latter half of the 19th century. They were often less grand or architecturally elaborate than the most prestigious of the Magnificent Seven, but they served the crucial purpose of providing accessible sanitary burial space for a wider cross-section of the population. They were the workhorses of the new system, ensuring that the problem of overflowing graves didn't simply reappear elsewhere. Historians still argue whether the speed of this reform was adequate given the severity of the public health crisis. Could the government have acted faster? Was the failure of the 1850 Act a necessary stumble, or did it delay essential action? Like debating whether it was faster to run to the shops for milk or wait for your flatmate to finally remember to buy some, both options involve frustrating delays and potential disappointment. Some argue that the decades of inaction before the 1850s were the real scandal, while others point to the complexity of challenging entrenched practices and property rights. The long-term legacy of this period is profound. London and eventually other British cities were physically transformed. The foul, death-ridden churchyards ceased to be active sites of decomposition and risk. The landscape of mourning was moved to the outskirts, creating those large green necropolises that still ring cities like London. These cemeteries became places not just of burial, but of historical record ecological oases within urban sprawl and quiet places for reflection and recreation. Think about it. Many of the parks and green spaces you might walk through in inner London today were once packed churchyards. That serene spot where someone is walking their dog might be directly on top of thousands of Victorian burials. It's a constant silent reminder of the city's layered history and the dramatic measures taken to make it habitable. The solutions weren't always perfect, and access remained an issue for the very poorest, for some time often relegated to less desirable sections or mass graves, even in the new municipal cemeteries. But the fundamental shift was made. Burial became, for the most part, an orderly, regulated process conducted in dedicated, spacious grounds, away from where people lived and worked. The bizarre, sometimes gruesome practices born out of necessity in the overcrowded churchyards, the stacked burials, the disturbed remains, the sheer lack of dignity, slowly faded from common experience. The fear of miasma and disease emanating from the dead began to recede, replaced by new public health concerns. But the immediate visceral horror of the urban burial crisis was largely mitigated. The story of London's overflowing cemeteries isn't just a tale of death and decay. It's also a story of urban growth, social change, legislative struggle, and the surprising ways in which practical problems can reshape our landscapes and our relationship with the past. It shows how even the most mundane aspects of life, or in this case death, can drive innovation and reform. And it reminds us that sometimes the most urgent solutions are the ones prompted by something as simple and as unavoidable as running out of space. The Victorian era, for all its rigid social structures and elaborate mourning rituals, was ultimately forced by the sheer physical reality of too many dead bodies in too little ground to radically rethink how it handled its departed. From the desperate digging of pits to the grand vision of garden cemeteries and the final legislative closures, it was a journey prompted by crisis and culminating in a transformation that still defines urban landscapes today. And with the official closure of the old grounds and the establishment of a systematic approach to burial in the new cemeteries, the strange, crowded, and frankly unsanitary saga of Victorian London's overflowing cemeteries finally reached its resolution. The dead were given space, the living were given cleaner air, and the city, layer by layer, buried its grim past.